Okay, it is now. Okay, everyone. Let me just put my camera on so that you can see me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shona Mortia and I direct the Center for Civil Society. So a very warm welcome to this seminar and a very warm welcome especially to our speaker, Dale McKinley. So today is the second seminar in which we are engaging with Dale McKinley. For those of you who don't know him, Dale is a key public intellectual in South Africa. He's a political activist. He's been involved in the South African social movement space, as well as in community struggles, and before that in the liberation movement. Dale is currently based at ILRIG, the International Labour Research and Information Group. And in our first seminar, we had a really interesting discussion around democratic organization and organizing, looking at some international examples and lessons. And today, Dale is going to be moving back from that, if you want to think of it this way, to look at the context of this organizing. And he's going to be focusing on the political, socio-economic and organizational pillars of neoliberalism in South Africa. And so this is the context in which these struggles are taking place. So once again, we are really thrilled to be able to engage with you, Dale, and thank you so much for coming today, and thanks to all of you. I'm going to hand over now to Dan, who's going to be facilitating. Looking forward.
Now, Andres is going to facilitate today, Shona.
Okay,
Andres,
Andres, handing over
yes.
to you.
Thank you very much, Shona. Dale, welcome to the Center for Civil Society and everyone else. Dale, we're going to give you around 30 to 40 minutes to give your talk. And then after, we'll then take questions and answers from the participants. Hopefully, it will be an engagement. And for those that have joined us, please remain muted and cameras off. Once we acknowledge when you have a question, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat bar. We will then acknowledge you, and then you can then pose your question. Dale, over to you.
Thanks, Andres, and thanks, Shona, Dan, and Simo, and the rest of the Center for Civil Society comrades. Yes, last week was a very, I think, useful and engaging, I hope, seminar that sort of set out some of the how should we say, challenges, democratic and organizational challenges that we as progressives or the left face in the context of some of the very real limitations that have been shown up in the last many years on our political and organizational fronts. But in order, when I was talking with Shona and talking about doing a couple of seminars, I thought it would be useful for us to revisit this whole, sort of context of neoliberalism, which is a term, as I said, that's thrown around all the time. It's just become a pejorative term for basically present-day capitalism in many ways, but I think quite sometimes not unpacked in the ways we just sort of use it as a general sort of covering kind of ascription to the things that we don't like. And in particular, I think it raises some very crucial issues around the role of the state, which are now even more, should we say, important in the context of what's been happened in our elections and some of the what I call pseudo-left parties or parties that would claim to be left or progressive, which look to the state as the fundamental sort of answer to this neoliberal capitalism that we are facing. So I wanted to look at the three different components of neoliberalism, because I think if we look at it in its totality, then we can understand not only where we've come from a little bit better, where we are, but possibly where we should be going, or some of the pointers in that direction in the context of what we would be considered broad left or broad progressive kind of politics and struggle. So as I mentioned from last week, thanks for those of you who've taken the time. I know that times are very crazy and busy and others. And for me, it's not the numbers that count, or how many people are in the room. And at the particular time, I think it's always, whatever the collective is, it's important that we have these spaces and these discussions. So I'm not one of those. I'm a bit old-fashioned in this sense. I don't have PowerPoint presentations and slick graphics and all sorts of other things show you. I'm going to be speaking directly to you and speaking through, and hopefully this will go fairly quickly because I think there's so much, there's no way we can cover all of the different components. But what I wanted to do was to go through things fairly systematically in terms of starting with an understanding of what we're talking about, and then working our way through each of these particular pillars and coming then to a sense of you know, where to, or at least pointers in that regard. So I just to remind ourselves when we use this word neoliberalism, and just to say that it is more or less, I mean, what you could say, it's agreed that this is a particular form of capitalist ideology and practice that has become dominant over the last 3 to 4 decades in particular, although its genesis and its roots go much deeper and farther back than that. But it has become, became in the 1980s and has been since then more or less the dominant, what I call macro development paradigm, the framing, not just in the so-called North and West, but also across the global South. And as well, and just to also say that the core ideas for this neoliberalism originated actually way back in the 1930s, with particularly with a economist called Friedrich Hayek, and then later on another U.S. economist in the 1970s and 80s called Milton Friedman. And there are 3 key, even though one could list many more, but just to point the 3 key components of this neoliberal project that I think animate and frame what we're going to talk about, and in some ways follow each of those 3 pillars. So one is the economic, which is the capitalist market possesses this natural efficiency, both productive and allocative, and there's nothing that is more efficient than it. There's nothing that's better than allocating value and exchange and other things in the economic sphere, and therefore it must be left alone. And that comes to the second point, which is the political, which is the government interventions or regulations of the economy or interference in the market distorts things, is inefficient. Of course, unless it's to save capital from itself, as we've seen with the financial crises and those contradictions. But nonetheless, the theory is that you keep, in this case, these interventions to a minimum when they're interfering with the market. Of course, there's no problem with the intervention when it's to, as I say, to save the market, in many cases from itself, as we have seen on numerous occasions. And then the third aspect of it is that when these free markets do fail, which they do, and this is recognized, that they can be easily corrected with minimal economic costs. That in some, they'll self-correct, they'll find an equilibrium, and they'll move forward in that way, and they don't need the assistance of the state or of civil society or the people themselves and people's organizations to interfere in this. And that comes in the context of the organizational. I'll speak to all those things. So just to posit that basic sort of theoretical framework. But to just take that further quickly is to say that the discourse that emanates from this sort of theoretical framework of neoliberalism is that it considers itself the true and empirically verifiable simply because behind it is the dominant economic relations of forces that run the world. Financiers, bankers, core capitalists, others, that this then essentially translates into a political project, which is made possible, obviously, by the capture of political parties and the state itself. And I'm going to come to that because I think there's a particular misunderstanding of the role of the state in the context of our critiques of neoliberalism and what the alternatives are in that context. And as a result of this capturing of the political space and the state, as well as the dominant economic and monopolization of the sort of financial sector, and the financialization of the economy, the globalization that we talked, that has been apparent over the last 3 to 4 decades, what we therefore have is an economic reign of total flexibility, of labor, of capital, individualization takes center stage. We enter into a Darwinian world, which is basically about everyone for themselves. And if you can get ahead, well, that's fine. We're going backwards in that sense, socially and culturally. And we'll talk about how that's been played on in terms of the opposition to neoliberalism from the right, in particular, and how that's almost outflanked the left and the progressive forces in the present period in terms of the opposition to the status quo and the critique of the neoliberal elite and their failure to deliver the basics to the majority of the people. So in that sense, I also just wanting to isolate this issue of the nation and the state before we get into these three pillars. And here is where I think in many cases the progressives and left have got it wrong. Because essentially the understanding was always that, neoliberal globalization in its, the theoretical pillar, get the state out of the market. Therefore, the real role was to capture the state and then reposition the state in order to interfere in the market, in order to then try to contest capitalist power. And we see this all across the world in the 1970s, 80s as the dominant sort of progressive left political project. Was to do this here in South Africa, the same thing, essentially this capturing of the state. And then in the context of the ANC, it was about the two-stage revolution and the National Democratic Revolution in laying the foundations for the democratic consolidation and empowerment of the majority and economically, and then moving towards redistribution and the delivery of services. Of course, we know that's been a complete and utter failure and to do that in any meaningful way. But the point here is that the state was always seen as something that would be sort of anti-neoliberal. There could be essentially an anti-neoliberal force and something that would, if the left and the progressives captured it or took control of the state, then they could make use of it in order to be able to push back the neoliberal project and to hopefully then obviously create spaces for a much more non-capitalist or anti-capitalist political economy and society. That has not happened. And the reason I would argue that hasn't, and I'm not the only person, obviously this is an argument that has been quite widespread in some cases, is that in order for neoliberalism and the ideas of neoliberalism about individualization, about consumerism, about competition, about all of these things, in order for that to be consistently reconstructed and pushed into the psyche as well as the sort of sinews of society, there's this constant need to reconstruct this capitalist dominance. It had to be bonded to the nation state and to nationalism itself in order for this to happen. In other words, the global institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, yes, they could play a particular kind of role in forcing certain nation states that were trying to maybe, create a little bit more space through structural adjustment programs and other things. But once that battle had been more or less won, once that that globalization had sort of taken hold in the sense of people being forced into the international trading system and dropping tariffs and so forth and so on, as we did here in the 90s, practically then the nation and the nationalism and the nation state services and reproduces the conditions for capitalist accumulation and legitimacy at both the national and global levels. And that form has taken neoliberalism. So the state itself becomes the main vehicle for the implementation of this neoliberal project, which we've seen through the ANC, and we've seen in most other countries as well. The nation and the nationalism thus represent the core neoliberal capitalist means and ends for meaningful participation and expansion of the economic system of capitalism itself. So I would argue it's a symbiosis, and it always has been since the beginning, I would argue, from the beginning of industrial capitalism and the development of nation states themselves. And the conundrum or the challenge that the left has always found itself in is that many of the struggles that took place, particularly in the global south, anti-colonial struggles and independence struggles, took place within a nationalist frame, because that is what had been set up as the main unit of accumulation and the main unit of control, political and economic control in the colonial and then post-colonial periods. So the framing of the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist and more progressive struggle and the sort of developmentalist kind of alternative where the state has a particular role to play was tied umbilically to the nation state, was tied umbilically to a particular nationalism. And the idea that of the left was that this could be used as the platform to be turned into much more internationalism, a universalism, a progressive kind of setup. That has not really happened in any meaningful way, except for maybe a couple of exceptions in Central and South America that were somewhat short-lived in this context, and we could say in some cases in post-war Asia after the Vietnam War, we could see some of that, but it has not sustained itself in any particular way. So the fact is that it has been the right, and we'll come back to this, that has used this embracing of the nation state, the embracing of nationalism in a very socially reactionary and much more identitarian kind of politics, that has been able to increasingly capture this anti-systemic, anti-neoliberal status battle against the status quo, to basically convince many workers and the poor that, not only have the neoliberal elites failed you in that context, but it's essentially the answer is not obviously socialism. The answer is not more state control of certain things. The answer is within a reconfigured kind of narrow nationalism, a cultural, an ethnic, a religious, a socially reactionary kind of identities that will bring people together in their smaller groups and therefore be able to then contest the excesses of neoliberal capitalism. And the left has been generally unable to answer that, or unable to provide any meaningful alternatives. And that's why we've seen in Europe, in the United States, in South Africa, and many, many countries, this rise of the right as a sort of pseudo anti-neoliberal force in many cases, and being able to take that space much more effectively in a much more authoritarian and neo-fascist and increasingly proto-fascist direction in that context. So laying that foundation, therefore, then just coming to the three pillars in the context of the transition in South Africa. I don't have to remind, and I'm not going to go through once again that prior to 1994, the roots of neoliberalism were already very much there. The National Party had, and in the 1980s in particular, through its reforms and through its privatization initiatives and adoption of and signing on to taking out loans and the IMF and World Bank and all sorts of other things, had already integrated South Africa very much into not only just the extractive and accumulative economy, but into much more of a neoliberal frame by the time 1994 rolled around. But here was the problem for the ANC and the National Liberation Movement, was that while there was no problem in selling the democratic, the political component of, we now have one person, one vote, we get rid of formal apartheid, we'll have representative democracy that is, not racially defined. That was a fairly easy sell in that context. The more difficult one was, what are you going to do about the economic side of it and the organizational side of it, which was, of course, economically, where, again, not having to go through this, but the massive inequalities based on racial ownership, predominantly land, manufacturing, monopoly of the economy, so forth and so on, and an organizational frame in which mass movements, unions, civic organizations, youth, everything had grown into a hugely impressive and powerful force, social and political force, by the early 1990s. In the context, and one that was much, much more radical in its demands for economic and political liberation than the ANC was itself. So how are you going to deal with these challenges in the sense of these three things within a dominant neoliberalism, or neoliberalism that is fairly dominant globally, at least at the time? So let me just go through quickly each of those pillars and argue or say what I think has happened. So on the political front, basically what the ANC did was that, realizing that in some ways that to embrace a neoliberal economic side of things was going to be very difficult to sell, and they didn't even try that. So therefore you had the RDP, the manifesto, which was a classic sort of social democratic document, certainly not a neoliberal in the classic sense of it, much more redistributive otherwise, but not socialist, but certainly something a bit more progressive than a hardcore neoliberal program. And that sort of, took care in some ways of the initial kind of covering of that. But in order to sell the idea that the kind of representative democracy that was going to be implemented in this country with, classic, what they call, as we say on the left, the liberal bourgeois democracy, basically had to be equated with the will of the people. So in other words, the political form that went well with neoliberalism, which was liberal bourgeois democracy, representative the judiciary, the state, which was dominant in Europe and all of the neoliberal countries, had to be twinned to an economic program. And as a result of that, the ANC was very smart in that basically it sold this democratic version as opposed to people's democracy, as opposed to a much more radical participatory democracy, other kinds of forms of democracy that we had been struggling for in the 1980s. It sold this sort of representative liberal bourgeois democratic model as the will of the people. And why was that important? Was because neoliberalism could be twinned to the democratic, so the economic could be twinned to the democratic, such that neoliberalism itself appeared as a necessary and natural economic order that emanated from an equally necessary and natural political order. So these become, because at the heart of neoliberalism was there is no alternative. There's nothing else here. And you had to sell that to people to say, these are the natural outcomes. This is a natural economic outcome. This is a natural political outcome. So under such a scenario, democracy and development become synonymous with the growth of a capitalist neoliberal free market. These two things become totally intertwined and symbiotic. And that's what I call the South Africa's version of the neoliberal myth of to falsely twin democracy, in this case representative, or a form of representative democracy, to the needs of the capitalist market. And what has that done? What it has done is that it has produced an ongoing and systemic crisis of democracy that we have increasingly experienced, where institutional practices and forms of representative democracy, such as elections, local government, make little difference in the context of the key societal decisions which are taken by the market and those that run the economy and those that own the means of production and so forth. So if you look at it, it was a very, very smart way of doing things in the context of trying to sell a particular product, a political product and an economic product that were inherently anti-poor. They were inherently anti-transformation. They were inherently against many of the things that people had fought for in this country. And there you get the political and the economic side of things and those pillars coming together. Of course, the economic side was codified through Geer in '96 in formal terms. We're not going to go through all of what Geer said. We all know the components of that, which were sort of the classically neoliberal kinds of policy formulations. But here was the kicker, was that to use the power, that what the ANC chose and the choices that were made was to use the power of the state and the political and moral legitimacy of the ANC as a form of liberation movement. We've just talked about, in these elections, how that trajectory of the ANC getting 80-something% of the vote to 94 and then going down, down, down all the way through to this last 30 years has taken place. How they were able to use that to pursue and to join the class interests of an old, new, and old capitalist elite under the guise of a, quote, developmental state. And to basically sneak in neoliberalism as a natural, something we can't do. The balance of forces are too heavy. We have to basically do 1, 2, 3, and 4. We've got to drop tariffs. We've got to basically make sure that we are participating in the global economy, while at the same time, of course, what we are offering you is a political freedom through representative democracy and the vote. And these things were made to be coterminous in some ways and symbiotic. What was the third one, the organizational side of it? Well, in order for those two things to be able to be sold properly and to be able to be sustained, more importantly, what you needed to do was you needed to take care of this very troublesome for the neoliberals and for those that had made these choices, and particularly with the ANC, of these mass movements, of these large unions, of these very powerful people's organizations that had grown up throughout the 70s and 80s and represented their true independent, mass-based possible alternatives to a neoliberal capitalism, or at least even to a reformed capitalist order in the post-apartheid period. So here, what did they do? What was the pillar of neoliberalism, the organizational pillar of neoliberalism demanded that these organizations and that these movements be what? Absorbed, co-opted, deflated or repressed in varying different forms of the same. So it's throughout, as we saw throughout the early 1990s, many people were sucked in from movements into the state, into the movements. For those of us that we're old enough to be, we're in the branches, for example, in the movement at the time, or ANC or Communist Party, whoever it was. The whole idea was you must move into, be patriotic, move into the state, or come and join the ANC, and because this is where the things are. And a lot of those civil society organizations were absorbed into that or were weakened. At the same time, there was mass repression, which had particular forms in the early 90s and continued in the post-1994 period through the state, mostly repressing and delegitimizing more radical movements, more radical demands for basic services, for private anti-privatization, whatever it might have been, for land and other kinds of things. At the same time of doing that, they had to then create an alternative organizational forms in some ways. And what did the state do, and what did the neoliberals support and demand, was this notion of a neutered civil society in many cases. So a civil society and organizations that would fill the gaps that were going to be left by neoliberals' abandonment of basic governance, of services. And so those organizations in civil society that were supported were the welfare ones, the ones that were going to be able to, that were not political, that were not questioning any kind of, having any kind of anti-capitalist content to them, but were pushing a particular sort of a role, which was to fill in the gaps left by the abandonment of the state of its delivery duties, and neoliberalism not really caring whether or not poor people have enough to eat, or whether or not a child has a decent education, or whatever the case might be, or whether there's transport, or so forth and so on. So that was the one side of it, was the sort of filling in of this civil society space through neutered, apolitical, mostly welfarist delivery kind of mechanism kind of approach, which depoliticized in many cases the kinds of anti-capitalist struggles that were possible. And then also what it then did in the process of doing that, of course, was to pass on the job of the reproduction of labor and capital to the individual. It individualized that process, and all in the name of helping the poor, philanthropic, charities, whatever the case might be. So that you abandon the entire idea of creating a society in which it is intrinsically built into that society to take care of the basic needs of the population, of these things. And that neoliberal thinking was transferred into the organizational space. And also the third component of that was that this individualist, consumerist, competitive kind of mentality also transferred into the organizational space. So what happened to many of the organizations that were able to be built up in the next 15 to 20 years, some of the social movements and everything themselves became terrains almost of the same kinds of competitive, destructive, ego-driven, individualistic, corrupt kind of politics that one saw outside of the movements, and that came inside to the movements and virtually destroyed many of them. And we don't have to talk about that story in the context of what happened. But those three components are just in summary what I wanted to sort of how should we say concentrate on in terms of this particular intervention. But let me just finish off. I've got maybe 4 or 5 minutes left here. In terms of what the cumulative character and impact of that has been, and maybe some pointers in terms of how we might begin to sort of see our way out of what is, I would say, honestly, a very, very difficult situation that progressives and the left found themselves in, not because we haven't had a good critique of neoliberalism, not because we have completely abandoned the struggle, an anti-capitalist struggle, but because neoliberalism in all of its forms, political, economic, and organizational, has almost infiltrated every single sinew of society, including the progressive and the left side, both intellectually, politically, organizationally, as well as in many cases relationally. And that, I think, is where we have lost ground, a lot of ground in terms of answering the needs of the constituents that most of the left and progressive forces profess to be fighting for and struggling for, which is workers and poor people, for the most part, those that are left out of the system. So I don't have to go through all of the cumulative impacts of the neoliberal frame for the last 30 years. We know poverty, inequality, inaccessibility, privatization, all of these other kinds of things. But I wanted to just highlight the one thing, which is what is done is it's virtually destroyed the entire concept and experience of what we call, universal citizenship, of not a nationalist citizenship where it's, the Donbass, where we have our thing and we're a South African or we're a Zimbabwean or whatever, but the sense of the humanity, the universalisms that used to drive the anti-capitalist struggles. And then also of the same in terms of the entire concept of that, as well as of democracy itself. So we've been reduced to individuals, consumers whose relationship to the state and those that inhabit it mirrors the relational world of business, in the sense of dog-eat-dog kind of a situation that we talked about in terms of these principles and values that have been lost in many cases amongst ourselves as well. What does that say about where we might need to move? Again, without there's no easy answers and solutions to this. But starting to move out of this is, I would argue, 2 or 3 different things. One is on the organizational front, is that we've got to abandon this notion of big men, of leaders, of political parties, of intellectuals, of others that are going to come and rescue the situation, or we just need to form another organization that is going to, have the right ideas and then can capture people's imagination, and then we move in a particular direction. In other words, as hard and as difficult as it is sometimes for us to accept as whether we're intellectuals or whether we're activist intellectuals or whether we're on the ground or whatever occupation we have, is that to say that it's the people themselves, as many contradictions, as many ups and downs, as many, how should we say, difficulties there are out there, that for the endeavors, the movements, the struggles, the victories, the defeats, the collective power of ordinary people, of the demos itself, that's at the heart of participatory democracy, we have to re-believe in that possibility again. Because if we put our marbles, so to speak, in the state, in the political party, which much of the left has done over the last 30 or 40 years in its attempt to try to respond to this neoliberalism, we can see that this has not particularly worked very well. It has created some spaces, but in the context of the other side of it, which is, you can get certain state to be able to do certain things on the welfare side, but then you've got massive corruption, you've got massive demobilization of people, and you can see this within the electoral sphere, that to do the same thing again and again and again invites continuous defeats and more demoralization, and to turn away from the possibilities of that alternative to other more right-wing and much more reactionary kinds of alternatives that we've seen playing themselves out in the more recent period. So in the context of traveling that route, there's no guarantees, there's no prefigured models of success coming from above. It's about changing our consciousness, our lived experiences, our examples, and our creativity in doing things that begin to formulate. That is a different kind of way of doing things for much of the left and progressive forces in this country, because we want to have a model. We want to have the line. We want to have the party. We want to have things that are there around which people can coalesce, as opposed to building it in the process of doing it, of struggling, and of having no particularly easy answers to that, while trying to contest on a range of forces that are ideological, that are practical and economic and political as well. So I don't have enough time to go into more sort of, how should we say, sophisticated or complex understanding of these alternatives, but suffice to say 2 or 3 last things before I end, which is that oftentimes when we look at the situation right now and this neoliberalism, this dominance, we look at what's called the balance of forces nationally and globally, and it doesn't look great at all for us. But we have to just remind ourselves, going back to where we've come from, that it is not, this balance of forces is not something immutable, immovable. It's some objective reality that is just simply laid in concrete, and that it envelops and defines what is possible in the constant. It's not something that has to be obeyed as a supernatural construction like neoliberalism wants it to be, and that our human action has no little impact in the here and now. While it's an admittedly difficult struggle, it's not in our favor at the moment, and those balance of forces are certainly weighed in the other direction. If we privilege people, if we privilege their creativity, if we privilege those realities and the struggles that ordinary people have to decommodify their existence, to try to find ways beyond survivalism, to try to find collective ways of doing things, I have no doubt that we will come out of these things with new ways and forms of contesting that dominant space, that are move beyond the political party form, move beyond the state, and move back to the essence of what socialism and communism and progressive politics is about, which is about a much more collective and non-status quo scientific socialism, in the sense of something that sort of takes away the agency of people and almost puts it into objective realities that are going to happen regardless of what we do. And I think that we have to recapture that sense of reimagination in order to be able to do that, and in order to be able to contest these three pillars of neoliberalism. Let me just end off with a quote by this is a sort of, you could say, a anarchist socialist in overseas, who basically, it's no one who's known really well. It was just a piece I came across. And I thought it was just really a really good way of giving us some hope, but as well as a reality of where we are in this battle, which is, it says, what we need is a willingness to rethink politics, to develop a militant sense of hope, to embrace an empowering solidarity, and to think outside of established political orthodoxies. Along with this, healthy doses of humility, a readiness to listen and to learn, and the courage to confront and to fearlessly engage in difficult, patient, and consistently principled struggle, where we can plant the seeds to grow our self-belief in our individual and collective ability to change things, and be part of forging real, bottom-up, and interlinked alternatives, to be part of a new revolution. With those words, I hope that some of this has been useful for you. Sorry for taking a little bit more time than I should have, but thank you for the opportunity.
No, thank you very much to you, Dade, for the insightful talk and the quote at the end. I don't know if there's any questions. I do have questions, but then I'll give an opportunity to participants, to those that would like to ask questions directly to Dade, before I read out the questions that I have. I don't see any hand. Okay, Shona, your hand is up. So I'll take Shona's hand.
Thanks so much, Andres. Thanks, Dale. That was really inspiring as usual. My question is a quick one. Do you think that there might be, shall we call it, opportunities in the new configurations after the recent elections? Any openings there that you think might be, you know, opportunities for the left? I'm especially worried about things like, you know, people that I've talked to in social movements who insist that they keep connections with their grassroots base, but they've had to professionalize to an extent. And so they are, in a way, formulating themselves as you've described. I'm worried about how these movements are going to recapture the civil society space where we see the right moving in, like Operation Dudula, for example, moving in, and we see like, you know, I've been surprised at the kind of support they've got. You know, even you'd be having a conversation with someone who you thought was quite progressive, and that person says something and you think, oh, that sounds all Operation Dudula to me. What, are you a bit xenophobic? And it just, you know, those narratives seem to be moving into the civil society space. So I worry about how those are going to be recaptured by the people who I think are supposed to be there, not, you know, not these folks. Thanks, Andres. I'll stop there.
Dale probably can answer that before I put more questions.
Okay. Look, I do think there are always opportunities, and I think there are particular opportunities that arise out of this where we are right now, and as a result of the outcomes of these elections. And I'll start with the first biggest opportunity, which is, and I may have mentioned this last week, but the biggest winner in the election was the no vote. The no vote got more than the ANC, 41%. People, 41% of all registered voters, and including the 7 or 8 million who don't even decided not to register, are essentially the majority of South Africans are up for grabs in the context of ideological. And we've got to understand this. Sometimes I think we orient towards the electoral terrain far too much, which is understandable given that they're going to form a government. It's going to have particular kinds of impacts. But I think where the opportunity lies for progressive organizations is to move into the space where people who have lost trust in the system, who don't believe the politicians anymore, who don't support, all this hullabaloo of MK and everything else. The fact of the matter is that they're 14.7% of the 60% that voted of the 70 comes to about maybe 6 to 7% of the entire population, which is not insignificant, but it's mostly concentrated in a particular way. Operation Dudula completely flopped in the elections, by the way, because I think most of the people who were xenophobic went and voted for the PA and MK and others. But I would say, first of all, that the space exists out there for the majority of people who are looking for respondents and answers. So it's going and doing all that, that work that we've done to build movements that in some ways it's a difficult ask, I know, because it's starting in new frames, but talking to people, and also in particular, I would say, is twinning our politics and ideological work with practical work. In other words, people are desperate, materially desperate. The system is not going to respond to them. It's not going to create the jobs. The state is not going to do this. And so people have got to find ways in order to be able, we can make the demands that the state should have it should have all these things, fine. But at the same time, to do projects, cooperatives, communes, all sorts of other things that actually provide people. When I take the lessons from organizations, for example, who I ideologically disagree with, but who practically I agree with. So let's take, for example, how Hezbollah and Hamas started and how did they start? They started as organizations that started food kitchens, mostly dealing with poor people and everything, not big ideology, not here's socialism, not here's an anti-capitalist, everything else, but going in and taking care of people's needs, or trying to create collective buy-in and cooperative things. And as a result of doing that, again, the trust of people saw them, the state was failing them, and that turned into a political project, which I don't agree with where it went in that sense ideologically otherwise, but the lesson here for us is to take that space. So I think in that context, we have a lot of possibilities here. We need to continue the critique. We need to continue the fight on the electoral front in the context not of making electoral politics, but in terms of exposing all of the things of doing, making demands on the state. All of those things must continue to happen. But I think where most of our energies and efforts should be going to is building the groundwork for a movement. And the best way to do that right now is addressing people's basic needs and twinning that to a politics that says they're not going to deliver for you. That's not going to happen. Stop having those illusions. Here we can do it for ourselves. Self-organization. So it's not the party, it's not the state, it's us.
Thank you, Dave, for that. And we also have a question. We've had this narrative that the ANC coalition with other political organizations that are leftist leaning after the recent elections will destabilize the market and the rent. Do you see the market playing a role in shaping South Africa's democratic processes? Yeah.
So I just asked, do I see a role for, sorry?
And do you see the market playing a role in shaping South Africa's democratic processes? And can the so-called market subvert South Africa's democracy?
Well, capitalist markets have been trying to subvert democracy with varying degrees of success ever since they existed. So yes, the general answer, of course they can, and they will continue to try to do so. I was just giving an interview on one of the radio stations yesterday about the Fitch rating agencies, which is one of the big credit rating agencies in the globe, issuing a statement to say, trying to influence the outcome of the coalition talks by saying that if it's an ANC-DA coalition, it'll be much better for policy continuity for everything. In other words, trying to manipulate. So they were always going to try. And of course, they will have massive impact, precisely because we live in an economy which is so monopolized, which is so integrated into global capital. And when we say global capital now, we're not just talking about Western capital, we're also talking about Chinese capital and possibly even Russian influences in capital as well, to some lesser extent in our context. But global capital in the broader sense of the term, yes, it would certainly can subvert a lot of different things, but only to the extent, should we say, to the extent the way that it goes, that for those of us that are trying to, should we say, forge a different kind of democracy, allow that to happen. Sometimes I think we orient our own democratic experiences to try to fit in with the dominant forms of democracy, which is understandable to some extent, instead of going back to the lessons of, in some ways, of our own past, as well as many other struggles, which is that to form, and I continued, last week we talked about Rojava, and we talked about what the revolution is doing there. And I would say to us, let's look at other practical examples of where people are establishing things outside of the state, where people are establishing self-organized, where democracy is taking on different forms, where capital can influence but cannot dictate, where capital doesn't have nearly the footprint that it does in these other terrains. So if we play on the terrain of capital, we're generally going to lose. We might win some small victories, but generally, and we're going to be reliant on the institutions, a legal victory here and there, or so, of capital itself. Whereas opposed to trying to build, which is a much longer and more difficult process outside of that, I would say that's a much better, longer term probabilities to neuter as much as possible their influence and the interference of capital in trying to continually dictate the developmental trajectory.
Thank you. And also we have a question from Michael, where he's speaking about developmental state idea, the RDPs, and etc. So to imitate the nationalist project in post-war Europe in strategic outposts like South Korea and Taiwan. Was the mistake of the ANC not thinking that the empire would tolerate such where strategic value wasn't present? So there's a question from Michael.
Yes, I mean, look, that's been a debate for quite some time in relation to whether or not the ANC, even in the mild sort of social democratic kind of context in South Africa, was even going to allow, which was clear that they didn't want that even to happen, because Gear essentially then immediately almost replaced the RDP. So to some extent, that yes, I mean, but it was consistent with what the ANC had made their decisions previously. But here's I want to just get to the core of that question, which really has to do with this issue of balance of forces. And here's something that I think sometimes we fall into the trap of as lefts and progressive people, which is, there's this Marxist Leninist kind of frame which says the objective balance of forces are the objective things. We don't, history is not of our own making, it's not of our own choosing. We have to relate to these balance of forces. And the way that got turned at the particular time was international capital and the empire is just too strong. They will screw us over if we move too far to the left, or that was certainly the arguments within the movement at the time. Therefore, you rationalize the shift to the right, or the embracing of more neoliberal kinds of things. Even a mild form of a radically redistributive kind of RDP would have been too much to do. What that does, if we accept that is the left, this notion of the balance of forces, whether it was then or now, and we look at now, and we certainly, yes, realistically, the balance of forces is not in our favor at all. But where is it in our favor is the question that we're asking. And where, just back to Shauna's question, it's in the favor where the masses are. Because if the masses are out there, most of them, and a large portion of them who are already opting out of the system, or at least don't believe in it, and we orient towards them, we can shift the balance of forces. But if we play on the terrain within which we've been chosen for us all the time, and we're always referencing the power of capital as a means, we will then come to the conclusion that there's no way that we're going to be able to achieve anything beyond mitigating the worst impacts of capitalism, which is what the biggest victory, I would say, of neoliberalism is it has convinced most people that not only is there no alternative, but the best we can do is just to mitigate, put band-aids on, and create a little bit of redistribution here and there. That battle, that ideological battle, which was lost in the early to mid 90s, is the same ideological battle, I would argue, that we're engaged in right now, and we need to rethink the way in which we relate, because it's about, if you're talking about forces, where are the forces that would be potentially progressive, anti-capitalist, otherwise? Let's orient towards them. Let's orient towards those kinds of forces and patiently try to build those forces into a where we can really contest, not state power, but contest societal power.
Yeah. And then also we have a question. I mean, you spoke about South Africa, the ANC, and now the question is, how do the outcomes of South Africa's election shape the trajectory of neoliberal economic policies within the country? And also on that question, how do the results of South Africa's election impact the power dynamics between the government, multinational corporations, and civil society actors, particularly in sectors affected by economic restructuring?
Wow. Okay. So that's a big question. Can you just repeat the first question? Let me deal with that, then I'll come to the second one.
Okay, how do the outcomes of South Africa's election shape the trajectory of neoliberal economic policies within the country?
Well, I don't know if we can project that, but I would say that there's going to be what I call pseudo contestation. So what we have here is we have parties that are basically fighting over, there's nobody here, there's no one in the electoral terrain right now who's the main 5 or 6 parties that's fundamentally questioning the capitalist system, that's fundamentally questioning a broad neoliberal framework. What they're going to fight about is who gets pieces of the pie, who gets more pieces of the pie than other people do. How do you cut that pie differently? And using racial transformation, or bringing back to us as MK, it's our economy. We must we must nationalize everything, or whatever. Those kinds of pseudo debates in the context are going to, I would argue, dominate. It's not about productive. It's not about accumulative issues. It's about distributive issues, and distributed not in the sense of redistributing, but of simply just playing with the distributive component of the neoliberal capitalist system. Neoliberalism is its own worst enemy. None of these political parties themselves, I don't think, are been able to take on or have any desire to take on any kind of major anti-neoliberal kind of project at all. But they will try their best, as we see MK and EFF doing, to cover it in a radical rhetoric of people-friendly redistribution. We've never dealt with the legacies of apartheid, so we got racially, all these other kinds of things, while leaving the fundamental productive and accumulative bases intact. In other words, where real power actually lies intact. I think that's what you're going to see. So in that case, you're going to see this game being played out within the electoral and then the terrain, and fighting over who gets what component, who gets what slice of that, but not really fundamentally tackling anything meaningful in the context of the foundational pillars of neoliberalism or of a capitalist system. What that will do is it will confuse, and it already has. It confuses and captures a lot of people, because they see there's such desperation, and there's such fear, and that's why we have rising xenophobia. That's why we have a whole range of things happening in terms of the social reactionary kind of politics that's coming to the surface, is because people themselves are afraid of what it is that lies ahead that's even worse for them. And so if you retreat into something, your own ethnic group, your own linguistic group, your own national group, your own whatever group it is, you feel some kind of belonging and some kind of certainty, at least more so. And it's up to us to contest that by offering other universals, collective, cooperative, other kinds of possibilities. Because if we don't, we will and are going to lose this battle.
Yeah. Dale, we've got about 5 minutes, so I'll give it 5 minutes, but these are three important questions that I think we need to go through. And these are more community related. I think one is on what tensions arise between neoliberal economic policies which prioritize market forces and profit maximization, and the principle of just transition, which advocates for equitable outcomes for workers and communities affected by economic restructuring.
Sorry, you're just going to have to repeat that question. There's a lot in there. Sorry.
So it's about the tensions that are there that arises, because then I mean there's this new concept of just transitions, and I think this is built from on the seminar that we had yesterday, where I mean there's prior to the elections, South Africa was moving more towards just transitions. So now the tensions that are there between neoliberal and just transition, how do we then assess those challenges? Yeah, or to identify those tensions that are between neoliberal economic policies and the just transition.
Well, I mean, I think, it's just like when when climate change became a big something that nobody could ignore, most people, except people like Donald Trump and a few of the real crazies, who can't ignore climate change anymore. What did neoliberal capital do? It sought to capture it, which it does every time. It captures greenwashing, carbon trading, all these other kinds of things that attempts to try to sort of say, yes, of course we're concerned with this, and the same I would argue in the sense of the just transition, which is of course this embracing of renewable energies in the context of the moving away from fossil fuels, at least. Some of there is tension. There's tension within capital itself for those who want to move in that direction, and those who want to continue the oil and gas corporations, and others who are still making, and who are playing, many of them who are playing both sides of the same game. So getting as much as they can and squeezing continuously out of what is contributing to all of our climate issues and our environmental destruction, while at the same time embracing this sort of transition to things and new jobs and technological fixes. So I think the tension is going to play itself. It seems to me that the tension plays itself out mostly within capital itself and within the ruling class as to how fast this goes, who gets what again, the slice of the pie. You can see this, where ordinary people who get sort of caught in between all of this push and pull. In many cases, I think where the potential lies to best integrate, to intervene in that sense, is once again to start creating self-organized alternatives to those kinds of things. In other words, as opposed to relying on, for example, the mass production of solar panels, which are going to then replace all, for every geyser, everyone must have a solar geyser, for not necessarily a bad thing, but then that plays right into the hands of capital itself in terms of their own accumulative needs. So, we have oftentimes shied away as lefties and progressives, particularly in South Africa, of solutions that are not big, that aren't big and national and massive and have scale, as opposed to looking at smaller scale opportunities that can be built up and that can be used as examples and other kinds of things. And I would say in some ways we're at that period where that's where we should probably be concentrating most of our energies and efforts. One, because it's feasible. Two, because it has direct and immediate impact in people's lives, even if on a smaller scale. And three, it can act as a practical pole of showing an example of something. There's nothing better to convince people than seeing it, that it works, that something actually delivers and works. And it's not contingent upon a capitalist. It's not contingent upon the state giving you a grant. It's not contingent upon foreign investment. It's not contingent upon the Chinese or anybody else, but on ourselves. So it goes right back into that discussion that we just previously had. I hope that maybe answers some of that question.
Okay, perfect. This is the last one, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to capture it within a minute. Then we can then close. In terms of opportunities, I mean, we've just had elections, and from the elections that have happened, do you see them advancing a more inclusive and participatory democracy that will prioritize the marginalized, particularly in terms of economic reforms?
I wouldn't say that I see this particular electoral outcome and as catalyzing participatory democracy per se. But what I think it does is it opens up possibilities. It opens up new doors. Going back to my initial comment about the majority of South Africans who did not participate in this electoral terrain. I always have argued when taking on right-wingers or taking on those that always want to poo-poo and just destroy any sense of real alternatives, is that those that actually, left and progressive forces, not in a party political form, not in a particular, we have a manifesto that people can vote for or support, but in terms of the ideas of collective, of human, of equality, of justice, of treating each other with respect. This is the majority of humanity that wants this. It's clear that it's the majority. And so in that case, the spaces for participatory democracy are more potential than ever. This is the irony of our situation. We've got the rise of the right. We've got neoliberalism that's sort of going through a whole range of contortions, and we've got capital that is just doing more or less whatever it wants. We've got most historic levels of inequality within our own country as well as globally. And yet at the same time, that space for participatory democracy has opened up like never before. And the possibilities of new things are there. The question for us as activists is, are we up to the task? Are we too tired? Are we too disillusioned? Are we too cynical? Are we just too, whatever? I'm not sure. And the new generation, and when I say us, I mean it in the comprehensive sense. I don't mean that the oldies like me, whose role is going to be increasingly less and less as the next years come. It's going to be the younger generations. So can we inspire? Can we create those spaces? Can we do? I think so. I think it's going to be a long and hard battle, but my answer to that would be a positive yes. It can create, but not because of the elections, but because of how we respond to them.
Okay. No, thank you very much for that. And I must say, Dale, this was really an interesting talk and great insights from you as well. I'd also like to add that, there's still a long way to go before you can resign or retire. So there's a lot of things to do in South Africa. Yeah. And then also there was a question from Matabeli in terms of the code that you spoke. Where does it come from? Probably you could share that, then we close.
Oh, yes. I saw that, and I was going to, I have to, because the person is not that well known, I'm just going to have to go back into my documents. So sorry, right now it's not on the tip of my tongue, but I will provide, let me hang on a second. If I can, it's an activist intellectual who's based in the United States, who has written many different things about Trump, and I can't think of his name right now. Sorry about that, but I will give it to CCS, and you can pass it on.
Yeah. No, certainly.
In some ways, it's good that I don't remember, because many of the best things that are said are from people that we don't know about, really, not those that we do.
Yeah. No, having said that, thank you very much, Dale, for the time and the two seminars. Like I said, they were quite insightful. And thanks to everyone that joined us today. You can check our YouTube site if you want to revisit this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you always for the opportunity, and thanks to the comrades at CCS.
Thanks so much, Dale. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Andries. Dale, I think that we need to talk further about scaling this up. So we take it from the seminar level to a dialogue level. Like, what shall we do next? Let's increase the space and, yeah.
Absolutely.
Or engagement, because I'm just reading one of these comments here, and what you talked about today, and it was described as an empowering session. So there, your impact on people, even in a small seminar space. So I think it would be a waste not to take this further. And, even the way that you've crafted these two seminars was really incredible and useful. Thank you.
Oh, by the way, I just found thank you so much for that, Shauna, and I appreciate that. And I've just found the name of the person. His name is Henry Giroux. It's Giroux. Henry Giroux. That's the person who I was quoting from.
Okay. We will
Okay.
look him up. Thank
Yeah.
you,
Thank
everyone.
you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Andres.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.